Thank you for your interest in this presentation on lasting adverse effects of psychotherapy. My name is Lavanya, Thana, and I'll be presenting salient findings from a qualitative study completed as part of a PhD project at Imperial College. I'd like to acknowledge the important contribution of my supervisors, Professor Mike Crawford and Dr. Tim Weaver, as well as the service users and therapists who took part in this study and did not remain silent about their experiences. Although the effectiveness of a range of psychotherapies has been widely evidenced, far less attention has been paid to the adverse effects. It is of critical importance for both service user experience and safety to understand the potential for these effects, as well as how to detect, manage, and to prevent them. In addition, research is necessary to establish the cost and other implications for health services and to inform healthcare policies and clinical guidelines. Since the first observation of deterioration effects, there has been macro and meso level reluctance to consider these phenomena. That is, until a recent review on potentially harmful therapies, which has reignited interest in the area. Previous meta-analyses and reviews suggest that between 3 and 15% of clients get worse from therapy. A range between 0 and 28% of service users and therapists identified negative outcomes was found in a systematic review conducted as part of this PhD. And in a recent UK survey, we found that 5% of the 14,600 service users receiving therapy through IAP services reported experiencing lasting bad effects. Part of the disparity in these figures can be accounted for by the operationalization of these outcomes. These are complex and multifaceted phenomena, which has meant that literature is replete with diverse and overlapping terminology and definitions. As shown here, there are many terms which are often used interchangeably in the literature. For example, treatment failure has been used in different studies to mean failure to benefit, worsening, as well as relapse. Types can also be distinguished by duration and severity, from temporary to enduring effects, and those that are more subtle to more pronounced, including extreme forms such as suicide. The focus of this work is to understand harms that are lasting in nature. The aim of the study was to understand the internal, interpersonal, and contextual factors associated with negative outcomes in psychotherapy. A constructivist-grounded theory methodology provided the overarching framework for the entire project. Categories and theoretical concepts were developed using iterative phases of data collection and constant comparative methods of analysis. In-depth interviews and focus groups were conducted with 23 service users and 21 therapists from a range of settings, including a trial of psychoeducation with problem-solving therapy for people with personality disorders. Inclusion criteria for service users included a self-reported negative outcome no less than 3 months prior to ensure the lasting nature of the harm. 61% of these participants completed a follow-up interview 6 to 12 months later. Those in the process of filing or involved in an ongoing formal complaint were not eligible. However, only 2% of the service users screened for this study had made a complaint about their experience. Analysis of the co-constructed data resulted in the development of 2 distinct and complex conceptual models. I will present the most salient concepts from these models to give a flavour of the grounded theory. Starting with the service user's perspective, data indicated that a core component of the service user's experience involves a breach of a fragile sense of faith constituted by 3 interconnected categories. Firstly, service users seem to maintain a cautious hopefulness through therapy, placing trust in the therapist at a particular time of vulnerability. However, this trust seemed to waver as therapy progressed. These hopes are often very different from and conflict with negative expectations, which are much more ingrained and are characterized by certainty. Service users seem to evaluate processes in therapy using this negative lens of expectation. Breaches of faith could be pinpointed to particular nuanced actualizing moments in therapy when these negative expectations become realized. These pivotal moments seemed to change the trajectory of therapy and often went unrecovered and unacknowledged. The aftermath of this therapeutic breach involves lasting consequences that range from subtle to pronounced forms. These include worsening and emergence of new symptoms, impact on or loss of close relationships, as well as suicidal ideation and even attempts. Most commonly, these consequences included a loss of hope and a profound and devastating sense of disappointment, as well as feelings of anger. This loss of hope seemed to compound the service user's fragile sense of faith, which in turn seemed to contribute to rigidity in future help-seeking. Most reported at least one enduring consequence at the follow-up interview. Fundamental to these experiences, however, was a sense that their concerns had gone unheard. Other personal and interpersonal processes associated with these experiences are included in the 4 categories shown here. Only a few participants attributed their adverse experiences with the model of therapy used. Ticking boxes is characterized by a clinical or sterile therapeutic relationship, one lacking warmth and human connection. Some participants express feeling forced to conform to the expectations of a conditional system, for example, being offered a one-size-fits-all approach to treatment. As suggested by this quote, "Beggars can't be choosers," they often felt they had no choice but to accept the limited treatment offered. Service users seemed to reach points in therapy when they considered questioning or challenging the therapist. However, the therapists held a powerful, expert role, while service users often doubted themselves. In the process of negating their own concerns, service users' power is suppressed. Service users commonly reported persisting with therapy, often without disclosing adverse effects. They seem to uphold particular conditions for disclosure, including the receipt of empathy. Some also reported protecting the therapist or the referring clinician, not wanting to upset or to disappoint them. From a therapist's perspective, data indicated 3 core conceptual layers which encompass 12 categories. Firstly, therapists appeared to experience difficulty engaging these phenomena and grappling with the associated contributing factors. Although most acknowledged their occurrence, discussion often remained at a conceptual level rather than about their own clinical cases. There seemed to be uncertainty about definitions and criteria for identifying harms. This, as well as their own negative experiences and their sense of themselves in a healing profession, were indicative of therapists' internal conflicts in the therapeutic process. These conflicts created discomfort, which comprises a layer, internal dissonance. I'll expand on this in the next slide. Therapists also seem to employ various strategies for managing or mitigating dissonance at both individual and system or service levels. Therapists also reported experiencing negative effects linked with their clients' experience of harm. They described a sense of mutual investment in therapy, and that this, coupled with their sense of responsibility, contributed to their own experience of negative effects. They often reported self-doubt, loss of confidence, shame, guilt, burden, powerlessness to change the course of therapy, anxiety, and worry. Some therapists also reported consequences for their reputation, and some examples were given of therapists considering leaving the profession altogether. The therapists seemed to have an immense sense of duty, and some held themselves responsible for the outcome of therapy. However, they also feared criticism from colleagues or blame from service users in the form of formal complaints. Less experienced therapists often seemed to blame themselves for treatment going wrong. The therapists appeared to employ protective mechanisms to mitigate these negative effects, as reflected in this quote here. I think it would make me feel very guilty. I think I would look for ways to understand it, and potentially that would be about trying to share some of the responsibility for things not going well. Data indicated a spectrum of these protective processes and behaviours employed by therapists and services from passive to active forms. For example, maintaining silence about negative effects, persisting with therapy despite them, and reinterpreting the outcome in uncertainty. Grouped together, these can be accounted for by mechanisms of avoidance, repudiation, and mitigating blame. 2 further examples are included here. In revisiting this diagram, it appears that the mechanisms of holding uncertainty, protecting, and reinterpreting the negative outcome fit within the areas of overlap of the 3 layers. Combined, these conceptual layers contribute to a distorted lens. This type of blindness appears to prevent the detection of harm. This model summarizes the primary concepts from the service user and therapist perspectives. Multi-level and profound silence currently exists surrounding these phenomena. This silence appears to subject both parties engaging in therapy to potential untoward detrimental effects and enables them to go undetected and unmanaged. This work lends its voice to calls for a paradigm shift in thinking about the potential for harms in psychotherapy. The cases of harm explored in this work extend well beyond deterioration of symptoms, as they have significant personal consequences for service users as well as for staff. There should be uniform and consistent reporting of service user experienced harms alongside that of adverse events in trials. And finally, some clinical recommendations. In discussing goals for therapy, it may be important to elicit and separate service user hopes from their negative expectations. It would also be important to identify breaches, to acknowledge them, and to work through them in the process of therapy. Service users may feel powerless to disclose their harms. Therefore, it may be necessary to actively open channels for concerns to be raised. Training and supervision should include awareness building and normalization of the potential for harms. Consideration should also be given to the mental health and well-being of staff. Given that only 2% of those screened for this study had made a formal complaint, it may be helpful in reducing therapist anxiety to make the distinction between formal complaints and that of harms. Thank you for your interest and attention. Please feel free to leave a comment or question below or contact me at the email address provided. I'll respond as soon as possible.